وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق والأصدق القائلين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. وقال الذي اشتراه من مصر لامرأته أكرم مثواه عسى أن ينفعنا أو يتخذه ولدا وكذلك مكنا ليوسف في الأرض ولنعلمه من تأويل الأحاديث والله غالب على أمره ولكن أكثر الناس لا يعلمون. ولما بلغ أشده آتيناه حكما وعلما وكذلك نجزي المحسنين. وراودته التي هو في بيتها عن نفسه وغلقت الأبواب وقالت هيت لك قال معاذ الله إنه ربي أحسن مثواي إنه لا يفلح الظالمون. ولقد همت به وهم بها لولا أن رأى برهان ربه كذلك لنصرف عنه السوء والفحشاء إنه من عبادنا المخلصين. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Last week in our conversation on Surah Yusuf, which I believe was part 4, part 5, we mentioned verse number 21 as a really important ayah, particularly the latter part of it, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُف. Joseph was thrown into the well. He was then raised by this caravan, then brought into the house of this elite from amongst the people of Egypt. And this man brings him to his wife and says, let's take care of this young man. Maybe he will be useful to us, or maybe we will adopt him as a son. And what is seemingly demonstrated by the evidence, just to go back to this point, is that Yusuf alayhi salam was taken into their home and he was utilized as a servant. He would work in their home and he was treated really well and he was taken care of and he was respected and honored because he was very kind, he was very pious, he was very diligent. And it's really unique now that he's still this young man. He's just like this, he's still a boy, virtually. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then reminds us, and He states, وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُف. And just like that, we did what we had to do for Yusuf. فِي الْأَرْضِ وَلِنُعَلِّمَهُ مِنْ تَأْوِيلِ الْأَحَادِيثِ. Meaning he was able to get away from that really scary, frightening situation whereby he was in a well, destined for death. You know, as we mentioned last week as well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala almost gives him some sense of revelation or some sort of consolation at that moment, telling him, don't worry, you know, there is a way out, there is a path out for you. And then over here he says, and this was the way out. وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُف. The fact that we placed you into the home of this really important figure in Egypt, وَلِنُعَلِّمَهُ مِنْ تَأْوِيلِ الْأَحَادِيثِ. And we have given you the ability to interpret dreams. So interpreting dreams, again, is a gift that has been given to some of the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it is amongst the ways by which God may communicate to some of His prophets. Through some of the prophets of Allah, God communicates to them via Jibreel, for instance, via revelation directly from an angel, while for other prophets, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspires them to respond in a particular way, and others He gives them dreams. And amongst them is, of course, Yusuf alayhi salam. Wallahu, and we see this, of course, from the very early part of the story, when he sees the sun and the moon and the stars, for instance, prostrating toward him. Wallahu ghalibun ala amrihi walakinna akthara an-nasi la ya'lamun. So over here, though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, so we have given this ability and potential and gift to Yusuf salamullah alayh, and we have placed him in this location where he's safe, away from sort of the crude intentions of his brothers, that doesn't mean that it's all over for him, right? It just means that this is all part of this path to achieve success. But he needs to cross more stages in order to reach the stage that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has desired for him. And so in this verse number 21, God states, وَلِنُعَلِّمَهُ مِنْ تَأْوِيلِ الْأَحَادِيثِ. We have given him the ability to interpret dreams. And in verse number 22, he speaks to another level of Yusuf alayhi salam. He states, وَلَمَّا بَلَغَ أَشُدَّهُ وَلَمَّا بَلَغَ أَشُدَّهُ. And we talked about this last week, that when he had reached the age, what age? We had reached the age of adulthood at the very least. آتَيْنَاهُ حُكْمًا وَعِلْمًا. We have given him and endowed him with more gifts, with the grace of wisdom and with the grace of knowledge. وَكَذَلِكَ نَجْزِ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. And that's the way that we reward those who are virtuous. Over here, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking to with regards to what He has given to Yusuf alayhi salam is not only signs or symbols of his prophethood, but also attributes and qualities that anyone and everyone can also attain. We have a principle within the religion of Islam via ayat of the Quran as well as ahadith, which speak to this notion of the attainment of tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where we are gifted the divine support of God to be successful in whatever endeavor that we're seeking to be successful in. But it requires, as God mentions in this verse, in verse number 22, وَكَذَلِكَ نَجْزِ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. And that's the way that we reward the virtuous, meaning God gives us knowledge, God gives us wisdom, God gives us the ability to be successful in our relationship or in our seeking of relationship with Him. This is again what is known as tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this divine support. And we see how that manifests very, very quickly later on. So in the next verse, and just keep this in the back of your mind, when Zulaykha, the wife of this king, like we mentioned last week, she approaches Yusuf in order to commit an act of adultery, in order to commit this act of indecency. Yusuf alayhi salam, he says in verse number 24, لَوْلَا أَنْ رَأَى بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ. That if it were not for the fact that I was exposed to the sign of my Lord, I would have indulged in this with you. But there is something that is prohibiting me from engaging. Physically, we put forth an effort to stop ourselves from committing an act of sin, but also physically, we put forth our effort to do good deeds. But oftentimes there are these, unseen measures which often take place, which either facilitate us performing a good deed, or at the same time, not facilitating us to perform that good deed. The example that I often give, right, is if you make an intention that when you leave your home, you're going to give X amount of money, whatever money is in your pocket, to the first homeless person that you see when you get out of the subway. I give this example a lot. But for whatever reason, you see multiple people who are homeless on your way to coming to the center after you get off the train, for instance, but you just forget to take that money out and give it. But your intention was there. So instead, later on, you take that money and you buy coffee with it. And you're like, oh shoot, but I made that intention to give it to the poor. Like, oh, I'll do it next time. But then the next time it takes a really long time for it to come, You make an intention to do something good, but something causes you to forget, even though you intended to do the right thing. What was it? You look internally within yourself first. That sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He strips away the ability for us to do a good deed. Doesn't mean we committed a sin, but He stripped that ability away from us because we didn't have what is known as tawfiq, this divine support, this sort of ability to unlock this potential to sort of manifest our act of good deed because of our own souls, because of our own hearts, because of our own selves. Sometimes, though, on the flip side, yeah.
I guess I'm wondering, wouldn't the intention of doing a good deed and then the process of doing so also be a part of attaining tawfiq? So then, I guess where do you kind of know whether it's not happening because you don't have tawfiq, but also you should do good deeds to attain tawfiq?
Well, yeah, we're going to get there. We're going to get there in a moment. But the reality, we don't know, right? That's kind of the process of growth, So on the flip side, just to continue, right? And let me know if this helps. Sometimes you don't intend to do anything good, but then you get an opportunity right in front of you and says, "Hey, do you want to do this?" And you wonder, why am I getting this ability to do a good deed, to serve, to whatever, right? Whatever it is, Someone appears in front of your eye who needs your help. And all of a sudden, you're able to offer them help, You're able to keep the door open. You're able to offer them some charity. Someone comes to you, you didn't intend to give any money in charity that particular day, and someone comes to you and you see their desperate need and you happen to find an extra dollar in your pocket. Oh, I didn't know I had this money, right? And you give it. Where does that come from? Many would argue that this also comes from this tawfiq of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At the end of the day, it doesn't mean that you are, that you won't get rewarded for the intention that you make, but it's not always about reward. It's about, it's really about the ultimate goal, which is to increase our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, more so than it is to actually get the reward for doing the good deed, if that makes sense. So the idea is that we're consistently developing and consistently growing and consistently cultivating this heart so that we're increasing our tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't know when we've reached the threshold and said, oh, this is definitely from God. We don't know, but that's kind of the joy, not the joy, but it's the struggle that we go through as believers in this world, where we always see that there's an opportunity to do more and to give more and to offer more. You follow what I'm saying? And so that requires us to consistently improve our intentions, to do as much good as we possibly can, so that we're increasing in the ability for us to receive tawfiq so that we can do more. You follow what I'm saying? So let's go back to this verse. So over here it says, in verse number 22, وَلَمَّا بَلَغَ أَشُدَّهُ أَتَيْنَاهُ حُكْمًا وَعِلْمًا. And when he reached of age, when he became an adult, we gave him this ability, or we gave him wisdom and we gave him knowledge. وَكَذَلِكَ نَجْزِ الْمُحْسَنِينَ. And that's the same way that we reward those who are virtuous. It doesn't say from amongst the prophets, to answer the question before. Anyone who does good, anyone who is virtuous in their actions, anyone who has firm intentions, God will create these measures where He will unlock success for us in that world of the unseen that we don't necessarily have access to. But it requires us to be in a state of subservience and submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in verses number 21 and 22, God speaks to the levels of Yusuf alayhi salam that he slowly attains. First, again, he is given this interpretation of dreams. Or, more than that, he has been put in a position whereby he can be successful. Why? Because he remained patient in spite of everything that he had to endure as a child. So God gave him that ability. Then he reaches adulthood and he went through whatever he went through, distant from his father, now in a foreign land, but still doing the right thing to the best of his ability. And over here, God gives him this wisdom and knowledge that came out of this, again, world of the unseen. So to say, came as a gift, as a tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then verse number 23. This is, of course, a lot of it is a summary of what we spoke about last week. وَرَاوَدَتْهُ الَّتِي هُوَ فِي بَيْتِهَا عَنْ نَفْسِهِ وَغَلَّقَتِ الْأَبْوَابَ وَقَالَتْ هَيْتَ لَكَ. That a woman had come, the woman in whose house that he was in, right? So again, the wife of Aziz al-Misr. She came into his room and she closed the door and she said, come to me. So he responds, مَعَذَ اللَّهِ. قَالَ مَعَذَ. God forbid. إِنَّهُ رَبِّي أَحْسَنَ مَثْوَايَ. And we talked about what this means last week. That surely he is my Lord and he has given me a good home. Meaning, it could have two meanings, like we said last week. One could be that your husband gave me this good home and I'm good. I'm not trying to engage in this, That's your husband. But in addition to that, it could be innahu rabbi. This is God. He's taking care of me all this time. Now you think that I'm going to disobey God? Innahu la yuflihu adh-dhalimun. And then in verse number 24, وَلَقَدْ حَمَّتْ بِهِ وَحَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَنْ رَأَى بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ. That again, she had this desire in order to seduce him. And he had this intention as well. لَوْلَا أَنْ رَأَى بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ. But if it were not for the fact that he was exposed at that moment to the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there was potential for him to engage in sin. كَذَلِكَ لِنَسْرِفَ أَنْهُ السُّوءَ وَالْفَحْشَاءَ إِنَّهُ مِنْ إِبَادِنَا الْمُخْلَصِينَ. And because of that, now this is important, and because of that relationship that he had with God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had turned him away from evil and indecency. Again, physically, you have an intention, you have a desire, But at the end of the day, if it were not for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and God protecting him at that moment, he would have engaged. There's no evidence to suggest that only because he's a prophet, that's the reason why he was gifted this. No. Again, all of the evidences prior to that speak to his virtuous nature, due to his patience, due to his devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whereby God supports him in this journey for him to get to that conclusion where he holds back against his physical desire and says, no, I can't engage in this. Sometimes it's like during the month of Ramadan, everybody's hungry, but we stop ourselves from eating. Physically, our desire is to eat every single thing in front of us, right? When we're very, very hungry. But why is it that we're able to stop ourselves from engaging in what would be a sin if we're eating during the month of Ramadan while we're fasting? Why do we stop? We stop because everyone around us is also not eating. We stop because, we've just told our minds we made this intention that we're not going to eat. But when your body is telling you you're hungry, you're still able to stop yourself because you've cultivated your heart, your soul to that measure where you can create that boundary between you and the food that's in front of you. That's really what it is. That cultivation, whereby you're able to reach that state, is assisted and aided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, undoubtedly, right? Because every other time throughout the year is so difficult for you. When you fast an obligatory fast versus when you fast a recommended fast, which one is more difficult? What's harder? It's much harder to fast a recommended fast, right? Because it's an obligation. This is what you have to do. But even when we're fasting a recommended fast, right, we still are able to stop ourselves because, again, we're conscious of God at that moment. And we know that even though no one is watching me, and I could totally go into the bathroom and drink some water, or eat this food when no one else is looking, or whatever it might be, and no one will find out, at the end of the day, I'm going to have guilt in my heart if I eat it. I have a conscience. And I also know that if I do this, I am going against the boundaries set forth by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so I will stop myself from this. So there is a possibility where you can go against your bodily desire at a given moment. You can stop yourself from sleeping. You can stop yourself from engaging in an impermissible sexual relationship. You can stop yourself from eating. It's not such that it is impossible. It's not easy. It's difficult. But again, that's what this is all about. This life, this journey, this struggle, this jihad and nafs that we go through. And over here we see that you're unable to be successful in that struggle of the heart, of the soul, if it is not for the blessing and the support of God. And that's what this verse is speaking to us about. Which is why it states, كَذَلِكَ لِنَسْرِفَ عَنْهُ السُّوءَ وَالْفَحْشَاءَ. That first he saw the sign of God, right? He just saw God. He didn't see God physically, but he was reminded of God. And because of that, he stopped himself and he turned himself away from committing an act of sin. Can everyone move closer just so that people are able to come and pray, as people will start to come in probably the next 5 or 7 minutes, even more so. So he continues, subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَاسْتَبَقَ الْبَابِ وَقَدَّتْ قَمِيصَهُ مِنْ دُبُرٍ وَأَلْفَيَا سَيِّدَهَا لَدَى الْبَابِ. Yes?
I had a question regarding the significance of the word choice in ayat 22.
Okay.
For wisdom, and why it was used with the like hukum, like word root, as opposed to the Arabic word root.
As opposed to which word?
The ayn ra sa word root. Why it's the ha ga mim.
Hukman as opposed to what word?
Like arafa.
Oh, okay. Yeah. We can remind me this question afterwards, inshallah. After at the end, if you don't mind. Thank you. So the different context to what when we talk about ma'rifa or arafa and hakama or hukma, we'll talk about that afterwards, inshallah. That's okay. Going back to verse number 25, وَاسْتَبَقَ الْبَابِ وَقَدَّتْ قَمِيصَهُ مِنْ دُبُرٍ وَأَلْفَيَا سَيِّدَهَا لَدَى الْبَابِ. So when he refuses and says, no, like I can't engage in this sin, I'm sorry, this is not going to happen, right? I see God and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like, oh Allah, like he's also making a dua almost. Protect me from this. Oh Allah, I see you at this moment. Don't make me like engage in this. What happens? She doesn't let it go. She literally chases after him. And what happens? As if it's like a scene out of a movie, quite truly. She's chasing him. He approaches the door. He's trying to get out of the door. He's opening the door, and who's there? Her husband. قالت ما جزاء من أراد بأهلك سوءا إلا أن يسجن أو عذاب أليم. And immediately, she screams out. She says, what should be the sin of the one who makes, who tries to chase after me and who tries to engage in, in an impermissible sexual relationship with me? Oh, my husband, what are you going to do to him? In other words, look what he's trying to do to me. In other words, she's trying to say, she completely changes the narrative. Perhaps you should imprison him, or perhaps you should punish him like really, really horrifically. Immediately, Yusuf alayhi salam, he's still a young man, right? He's a servant in their home, but still he has this courage and bravery immediately to defend himself. قال هي راودتني عن نفسي. I didn't do anything. She was the one who tried to seduce me. وشهد شاهد من أهلها إن كان قميصه قد من قبل فصدقت وهو من الكاذبين. So immediately he says, no, she was the one who was seducing me. I didn't do anything. And then at that moment, someone in the home, again we said before, either a child in the home or one of the ministers of the husband, according to different hadith, somebody in the home stood up and said, wait a minute. Before you punish him and before you penalize him, let's stop for a moment and let's see, where has his shirt been torn from? If it was torn from the back, that means we know that she was chasing him. And if it was torn from the front, then we know, that she was the one, that he was the one who was chasing her. وإن كان قميصه قد من دبر فكذبت وهو من الصادقين. But if his shirt is torn from behind, then she is lying and he is telling the truth. So what do we learn from these two verses, right? Before you jump to conclusions, settle down and come to a conclusion based on what evidences you have in front of you. فلما رأى قميصه قد من دبر قال إنه من كيدكن إن كيدكن عظيم. So when he saw the husband, he sees that his shirt has been torn from the back. He says to his wife, this is because of you and your women, you and your crew, virtually. For surely you guys love to deceive. And again, like I mentioned before in our conversation before we started formally, that likely this is evidence to suggest that there was this dimension of really problematic, sexual behavior in Egypt during that time, where having multiple relationships, particularly for women, was so common. And he doesn't respond to her or punish her or penalize her in any way. He basically just tells her, like I told you to stop like this behavior, without anything more, right? Which is kind of weird, almost. So at this moment, we understand again, like I said before, that Yusuf alayhi salam had the potential to engage in indecent, impermissible sexual relationships probably many a time. And because we know again of the youth of Yusuf, the physical attraction of Yusuf alayhi salam that he offered to those around, and so on and so forth, that there was this potential. But nonetheless, he was always able to remain chaste in light and in spite of all of the circumstances that he was living in, right? Again, probably what this verse or what these verses are trying to do is offer us some evidence with regards to the challenges and obstacles that he had to face during that time, living in that court. Yusuf, أعرض عن هذا واستغفري لذنبك إنك كنت من الخاطئين. So the husband says to Yusuf, tells him, get out of here, get out, don't get involved, and then he tells his wife that please, ask God for forgiveness. إِنَّكِ كُنْتِ مِنَ الْخَاطِئِينَ. Surely you are amongst the wrongdoers. You're a sinner. Like, you engage in this behavior. So the only sort of penalty he gives, he's the king, his wife is acting this way. He doesn't tell her anything other than ask for forgiveness and kind of move on. What happens at this time? This conversation obviously catches a lot of popularity, right? It's like, it's like a really interesting story, Everybody in their news feed, now they have what the wife of the king was engaging in. This is what she did to her servant in their home, and everyone started talking about it. So in verse number 30, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to this. وَقَالَ نِسْوَةٌ فِي الْمَدِينَةِ إِمْرَأَةُ الْعَزِيزِ تُرَاوِدُ فَتَاهَا عَنْ نَفْسِهِ. So the townswomen, they came together and they began to tell each other, hey, do you know what she did? She tried to seduce her servant. قَدْ شَغَفَهَا حُبًّا إِنَّا لَنَرَاهَا فِي ضَلَالٍ مُبِينٍ. She was so engulfed with her love for her servant that, she committed this really terrible act, So even though that, open relationships and indecency was so prevalent during that society, for someone to engage in a sexual relationship with their servant, that's not allowed though. That's impermissible. We don't do that. Virtually is what we get from this. فَلَمَّا سَمَعَتْ بِمَكْرِهِنَّ أَرْسَلَتْ إِلَيْهِنَّ وَأَعْتَدَّتْ لَهُنَّ مُتَّكِئًا وَآتَتْ كُلَّ وَاحِدَةٍ مِّنْهُنَّ سَكِينَةً وَقَالَتْ اخْرُجْ عَلَيْهِنَّ. So she begins to hear, oh, everyone is talking about me. They're judging me for my behavior. So what does she do? She gathers all of them together. Why don't you guys come over to my home? She's a big deal. She probably has a really nice home. She probably feed them really good food. So she gathered all of them together, and she each gave them a knife and some fruits and whatever. Many of you are familiar. And then she orders Yusuf, alayhi salam. She says, Yusuf, when I tell you to walk by this room, she still basically owns him, that you have to do this. You have to walk by. So they're all sitting at a table. They're holding these knives in their hands. They're cutting fruits or whatever. And then at this moment, Zulaykha, she tells Yusuf, now come out. فَلَمَّا رَأَيْنَهُ أَكْبَرْنَهُ وَقَطَعْنَا أَيْدِيَهُنَّ وَقُلْنَا هَاشَ لِلَّهِ مَا هَذَا بَشَرًا إِنْ هَذَا إِلَّا مَلَكٌ كَرِيمٌ. So they're all sitting. Yusuf alayhi salam walks through the room, and they look at him. And as they're looking at him, instead of cutting their fruit, they start to cut their fingers. They're unable to contain their sight at that moment, and they begin to call out, "Hasha lillah!" Like, this is unbelievable, Ma hadha bashara. He's not a human being. In hadha illa malakun kareem. Surely he is a noble angel. So number one, they attribute him to being angelic because of how he looks. But in addition to that, they also call him kareem. Malakun kareem, noble, generous, virtuous, a quality that has nothing to do with physical beauty. It's rather something that is a internal spiritual quality, and we see this throughout the Quran. Kareem is not a gift or a sort of characteristic that is attributed to someone's physical form. I want you to understand that for a moment. Meaning that they also saw something about him that was unique just from the way that he walked, right? That he walked with a sense of, how do we translate heba? Like, he walked with a sense of, he had some self-respect to him, There was some gentleness in the way that he walked that demonstrates something internally. And I just want to focus upon this point for just one moment. When we talk about like akhlaq or ethics in Islam, we talk about smiling. We talk about saying salaam alaikum. We talk about being nice to others. Being nice to others and smiling and saying salam and our behavior and character externally in reality is a reflection of who we are internally. Which is why when someone is being sarcastic when they're smiling at you, you could tell that they're just doing it kind of for show, right? Because it's not emanating from their heart. We could tell. Human beings can understand where someone is or who someone is internally for the most part, unless someone has cultivated their soul or their heart to such evil they can show on their faces that they tell their character on the basis of the way that they interact with us. Over here, they were able to demonstrate the relationship that Yusuf has with himself, that he has with God, just on the basis of him walking through the room and he was not looking at one of those women. He just looked down and he walked literally across the kitchen, for instance, or across the dining room. Yet they were able to demonstrate that from him. Why? Because his akhlaq it manifests from his heart into the way that he walks. You follow what I'm saying? قالت فذلكن الذي لمتن قالت فذلكن الذي لمتنني فيه ولقد راودته عن نفسه فاستعصم وإن لم يفعل ما آمره ليسجنن وليكون من الصاغرين. So then she says to those women, she says, This is the young man who you're all blaming me about. Look at the way you're acting when you just see him. I'm with him every single day. You just saw him for 1 second, you started cutting your fingers off. And she said, yes, I did. I am the one who tried to seduce him. But how can you blame me? And if he does not do what I asked him to do, then certainly he will be amongst those who are imprisoned. And I will treat him really poorly. We'll talk a little bit more about this next week, but just to continue, the next verse. What does she say over here very quickly? She says, if he does not engage in this sin, if he does not have, if he does not engage in sexual intimacy with me impermissibly, then at this moment, I will immediately put him into prison. I'm going to treat him, I'm going to treat him like a slave. To which Yusuf alayhi salam, we don't know what happens in this stage. But what we do know is that in verse number 33, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us the dua of Yusuf. قَالَ رَبِّي السِّجْنُ أَحَبُّ إِلَيَّ مِمَّا يَدْعُونَنِي إِلَيْهِ. That, oh Allah, know that prison is better for me than that which He's calling me to. وَإِلَّا تَصْرِفْ أَنِّي كَيْدَهُنَّ أَسْبُ إِلَيْهِنَّ وَأَكُنْ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. And if you do not turn them away from me, then I'm gonna be in trouble. So put me in a position where I can be successful so I can find you. So even if it be prison, oh Allah, I'm okay with that as long as I don't commit an act of sin. We'll talk about these two verses in our next discussion, inshaAllah ta'ala. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammad wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Allahumma salli ala